Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to completely unpack Matt Ridley's provocative and honestly deeply fascinating theory on how evolutionary arms races shaped our biology and behavior. You know, if you've ever wondered why human nature is the way it is, Ridley basically argues that you simply cannot understand it without understanding how human sexuality evolved. It's a pretty bold claim for sure, but by the time we finish walking through these concepts together, you're going to see the world and maybe even yourself through an entirely new evolutionary lens. Let's get into it.
We're actually going to start with this famous interaction from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland because it perfectly captures the foundational metaphor of our whole topic today. So Alice is running as absolutely fast as she can alongside the Red Queen. Yet the trees and the landscape around them just aren't moving at all. When Alice finally stops, totally exhausted, the Queen tells her that in this country, you have to run just to stay still. It's a brilliant, surreal piece of literature. But believe it or not, it turns out to be an even better description of biological reality.
Okay, let's dive into how scientists actually apply this. Back in 1973, evolutionary biologist Lee Van Valen was studying marine fossils, and he noticed something kind of puzzling. Species were going extinct at a totally constant rate, regardless of how long they had actually been around. Basically, past survival didn't equal future safety, and that's simply because the viruses, the bacteria, and the predators around them were constantly upgrading their own arsenals too. He coined this the Red Queen hypothesis. Every single species is running just to stay in place. If predators get faster, well, the prey has to get faster. The environment is just an endless arms race with literally no finish line. And if you ever stop adapting, you go extinct.
So applying this relentless evolutionary pressure to biology brings up a massive, glaring enigma that Ridley tackles head-on. Why on earth are we asexual species? I know, it seems like a strange question to ask. We completely take it for granted, but when you look at it through the cold, calculating lens of evolutionary efficiency, sex actually seems like a terrible, almost self-destructive strategy for a species to adopt.
The contrast here is stark. Think about it. An asexual population, essentially a cloning population, is incredibly efficient. Every single individual in that group can produce offspring. They don't need to go out and find a mate, they don't waste precious time and calories on courtship, and they can multiply at rapid speeds. But in a sexual population, only half the population, the females, can actually bear young.
Ridley calls this the twofold cost of sex. Basically, for every one baby produced by a sexual species, an asexual species can produce two. Over time, basic math dictates that the asexual cloning species should completely dominate and totally wipe out the sexual species. And yet, if you look around, almost all complex organisms on Earth reproduce sexually. So there must be a massive, hidden advantage to sex that completely outweighs this severe biological inefficiency.
And the theoretical solution to this enigma? Parasites. A cloning population is essentially a sitting duck, because every individual has the exact same immune system. Once a fast-evolving parasite figures out how to pick that biological lock, the entire population is wiped out in one go. But sex acts as a moving target. By remixing genes every single generation, sexual reproduction is constantly changing those genetic locks. The parasites, which adapted to attack the parents, suddenly find themselves totally locked out of the offspring. So we are literally stuck with sex just to outwit short-lived, fast-evolving parasites.
All right, moving into our next section, the peacock's tail, where we go from pure survival to courtship.
Ridley uses the incredibly cumbersome peacock's tail to explain sexual selection. Charles Darwin originally noted that these massive, heavy tails make the peacock extremely vulnerable to predators. So why do they even exist? Well, according to a concept called the handicap principle, elaborate ornaments are actually honest signals of genetic quality precisely because they are such a massive burden. Only a truly healthy, parasite-free male with fantastic genes can afford to carry such a dangerous, heavy display and still survive. It's essentially nature's version of a billionaire buying a massive, totally impractical mega-mansion just to prove he can afford the upkeep. The female peahen knows that if a male can survive despite that crazy handicap, he is absolutely the best candidate to father her offspring.
Now let's look at the battle of the sexes and reproductive strategies. Viewing this strictly through Ridley's evolutionary model, and keep in mind we're talking about biological models here, not absolute modern cultural truths. Differing biological investments caused men and women to develop contrasting reproductive strategies. Because the biological cost of reproduction for a female is incredibly high, we're talking pregnancy, lactation, and long-term care, the female evolutionary strategy leans heavily towards selectivity, discernment, and seeking out quality and resources. The male biological investment, on the other hand, is minimal, which evolutionarily pushed the male strategy toward competition, display, and seeking quantity. And these diverging goals create a perpetual evolutionary arms race between the sexes.
But humans throw a really fascinating wrench into this standard biological playbook. Ridley points out that human monogamy is a massive evolutionary puzzle. If you look at most mammals, and especially our closest ape relatives, polygamy is the standard. Monogamy is extremely rare. Yet, across human societies, it is uniquely consistent. So why? Well, Ridley theorizes that human monogamy evolved because human infants are born incredibly helpless. They require extensive long-term paternal investment just to survive. A father who stuck around and invested his resources dramatically increased the chances of his genes passing to the next generation.
Building on these differing reproductive strategies, the book posits the controversial idea that many psychological differences between the sexes are actually evolutionary adaptations. Ridley hypothesizes that our traits weren't just arbitrarily shaped by culture, but rather by millions of years of differing reproductive goals. In this evolutionary model, males were selected for competitiveness and risk-taking to win in male-to-male competition, while females were selected for extreme selectivity and nurturing. It all stems from differing genetic interests trying to maximize survival in that endless Red Queen race we talked about earlier.
That brings us to our final section, the evolution of human intelligence and the mind.
If evolution is purely about basic survival, escaping predators and finding enough food, Ridley asks a really brilliant question. Why is our intellect so unbelievably massive? Our brains are incredibly energy hungry, consuming a huge portion of our daily calories. And the truth is, early hominids really didn't need to compose symphonies, invent calculus, or write poetry, just to forage for berries and avoid saber-toothed tigers. So, what actually drove the brain to become so disproportionately powerful?
Well, here is Ridley's most controversial and I think most fascinating theory. He argues that human intelligence is, essentially, a peacock's tail. Just like those heavy, brightly colored feathers of the bird, Ridley argues our massive brains evolved primarily for courtship rather than mere survival. We evolved the capacity for brilliant humor, rich storytelling, and complex art simply because our ancestors found those traits intensely attractive. Intelligence became the ultimate indicator of good genes.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the Red Queen dynamic at work all over again. Ridley calls us the self-domesticated ape. As intelligence became attractive to our ancestors, it became absolutely essential to possess it if you wanted to reproduce. This kicked off an incredible feedback loop, a runaway intellectual arms race. We weren't evolving larger brains to outsmart predators, we were evolving larger brains to outsmart, charm, and impress each other. We were running as fast as we could, intellectually speaking, just to stay in the same place in the dating pool.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder from today's explainer. If Ridley's synthesis of the Red Queen hypothesis is correct, it means our grandest achievements in art, our deepest intellect, and our most complex social structures aren't just cultural accidents. They're biological strategies, forged in the fires of an endless evolutionary race just to stay in place. It really radically shifts how we view human motivation, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration of the source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.